Today we're going to be talking about Space Marines, and Space Marine units have a lot of bits and options that come in their kit, which is why I recommend checking out this video's sponsor, Magnet Baron. More about them later in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and a little while ago I tackled lists from every single faction in Warhammer 40k. But what I didn't do in that video is go through individual sub-factions, for example, Space Marine chapters, and that's what we're going to be doing today. So in this video, we're going to go through a competitive list for every Codex compliant and non-compliant chapter in the Space Marine faction of 40k. I've taken these from recent competitive events, mostly because I felt they were representative of the strengths or a typical list from that chapter. But I'm going to add some commentary myself, some ways that you may switch up the list, other trends that we typically see in that chapter, and ways that you can customize it yourself. So let's dive right in. And as always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, do all the YouTube stuff. You know the drill. This video took a really long time to create, so I would really appreciate it. Life is full of great mysteries, like how did the aliens build the pyramids? How many zebras are there? Why does a kilogram of steel weigh more than a kilogram of feathers?
Don't get it.
And most importantly, how do magnets work? Well, personally, as a certified dum-dum, I don't know anything about any of those, but I can tell you about someone who does, especially that last one, and that is the Magnet Baron. The Magnet Baron is your one-stop shop for all your hobby modularity needs. Whether it's flying stands that miraculously don't break immediately upon assembly, movement trays for easier and quicker play, or a wide selection of different magnet styles for customizing your models and accessories, including wild and wacky shapes like rings, discs, orbs, and cubes. A Borg and or Necron would be proud.
Resistance is futile.
But even better, the Magnet Baron has kits specifically designed for customizing your Warhammer 40k units. These specialized sets include all of the magnets and accessory parts you need to be able to build any variety of that unit out of the kit that you want. Magnets are pretty great. They keep my Hive Tyrants from ever going out of style on the tabletop. Today you will have 2 guns. And you should get yours from themagnetbaron.com. So with that out of the way, let's dive into the Codex compliant Space Marine chapters. Now, what I mean by compliant versus non-compliant is that the Codex compliant chapters are the ones that mostly take their data sheets and rules from the Codex Space Marines proper. Those ones have a PDF supplement that has a couple of additional rules with them, but generally speaking, they don't have any other mechanics. The non-compliant chapters have their own printed book to use alongside the Space Marine book, and usually have some special rules regarding how they're allowed to use the units out of the Space Marine Codex. We'll talk about them later in the video. As always, if you want to take a look at how these lists performed yourself, I'm going to put the player and event that they are sourced from down in the bottom corner, so you can check them out on Best Coast Pairing. So we're going to start strong here with Imperial Fists. And I've talked about it before, but Imperial Fists might have one of the most confused and eclectic designs in all of Warhammer 40k. They benefit both from having bolt guns, which are low-strength weapons, and having high-strength weapons like autocannons or plasma weapons, which doesn't really make sense, and it's hard to focus an Imperial Fists list on a particular strength that they have. But you can do your best. This list in particular is running a bunch of Tech Marines, both a Primaris Tech Marine and a Standard Tech Marine, alongside a Primaris Librarian, and the big fisty man himself, Tor Garadon. We also have a couple troops, 2 units of Infiltrators, and a Heavy Intercessor squad. Imperial Fists do synergize well with the Heavy Intercessors because they do benefit from bolt weapons specifically, and Heavy Intercessors are all about having multiple varieties of bolt weapons. Either their standard Heavy Intercessor bolt rifles, which are upgraded versions of the normal Intercessor bolt weapons, and or their free Heavy Bolter that they equip, which is a similarly upgraded version of a standard Heavy Bolter. The list also brings a ton of heavy weapons, mostly mounted on vehicles, including a Leviathan Dreadnought with a Storm Cannon array, 2 Suppressor squads that bring their autocannons, one of the most efficient ways to benefit from the Imperial Fists Super Doctrine of +1 damage against vehicles and buildings, alongside 5 Devastators with las cannons, 2 Gladiator Reapers, as well as a repulsor executioner. Now, the benefit of strength 7 plus weapons against vehicles is why we're seeing so many autocannon profiles and plasma, including the repulsor executioner with plasma, which can give itself, at least on its turret weapon, +1 to hit thanks to its aquiline optics. We also have a bunch of other +1 to hit effects from the Tech Marines and Torgaradon, the Gladiators, and the Leviathan all simultaneously. The suppressor squads in there, firing 9 shots apiece at 3 damage against vehicles, is nothing to shake a stick at, and the Gladiator Reapers benefit interestingly, given that the Tempest Bolters that are mounted on their sponsons will get the exploding 6's effect from the Imperial Fists doctrine. We also have a little bit of utility in the list to attack bikes with multi-meltas, as well as a couple scouts with a heavy bolter and missile launcher in each squad respectively to score secondary objectives and just help shore up the weaknesses of the list. Overall, there are definitely some gems in this list. I do think that the Imperial Fist synergy with units like the Leviathan Dreadnought and suppressor squads, getting that strength 7 2 damage profile up to AP2 thanks to Devastator Doctrine and 3 damage against vehicles, means that these units can do massive damage in the right situation, but the downside of Imperial Fists is that you do have to be in that situation for them to be super effective. We're going to get a little bit of a whiplash here on the power level of these chapters, moving from Imperial Fists over to Iron Hands. Now, I called out Iron Hands in the last videos talking about lists from every faction as one of the strongest Space Marine chapters, and I think that's still the case. Well, they've been overshadowed a little bit by Dark Angels that we'll talk about later in the video. Iron Hands are still incredibly strong, and unlike Iron Hands, have a very focused design, buffing specifically heavy weapons, both with AP from holding in Devastator Doctrine for the whole game, also removing the penalty for moving and shooting with them, and giving you reroll ones to hit, alongside of damage buffs both in range and melee, thanks to Mercy is weakness. This list in particular is making use of these unique effects by focusing very heavily on vehicles, autocannons, and especially dreadnoughts. We have a Primaris Lieutenant with the Vox Spiritum and Rites of War, a Primaris Tech Marine with the Target Protocols Warlord trait, alongside 2 units of 5 Infiltrators and 5 Incursors. A lot of forward deploy to act as screening units and prevent enemies from getting too far into the Redemptor Dreadnought castle, but also to help the army perform secondary objectives. We then have 3 Redemptor Dreadnoughts with Onslaught Gatling Cannons, Macroplasma, and Stormbolters, alongside a Relic Contemptor Dreadnought. This Relic Contemptor is really the heart of any Iron Hands list. It uses the March of the Ancient stratagem to be counted as a character, making it available to receive Warlord traits. Taking its 2 sets of Twin Volkite Culverins, it fires a total of 16 2-damage shots that get 1 point of AP thanks to the Devastator Doctrine, and is eligible to take the Merciless Logic Warlord trait, giving it exploding attacks, meaning for every 6 it rolls to hit, it gets to roll an additional attack. With +1 to hit from the nearby Primaris Tech Marine and a floating reroll from Target Protocols, in addition to the reroll ones that it already gets from being in Devastator Doctrine as an Iron Hand, this thing is basically 120-ish% accuracy. That means it's generally going to be hitting more times than it fires, and if you roll a 6 to hit on those Cyclone Missile Launcher shots, it can hurt immensely. You can then use All Mercy as weakness to also explode its wound rolls, allowing it to gain massive bonuses to its damage. All that from the safety of character protection, because Relic Contemptors are below 10 wounds, and having the character keyword means that standing near any of these other lookouts or providing units makes it untargetable by enemy return fire. This thing is just going to sweep away most units in its line of sight and be unable to be fired back upon. We also have some pretty classic Space Marine includes to shore up that Dreadnought brick. 2 units of suppressors, just like we talked about with Imperial Fists. They won't get that bonus damage, but they do move and shoot without penalty and get that extra AP and reroll 1s, alongside 2 units of Devastators. These are excellent in Iron Hands because they're able to disembark from their drop pod and ignore the move and shoot penalty with all those heavy weapons. Each of these Devastators is bringing a mix of multi-meltas and grav cannons, alongside Armorium Cherubs, in order to be able to double fire whichever weapon profile they need in a specific situation. Moving on, we have Raven Guard, and this is another chapter that is just a little bit confused. The premise of Raven Guard is that they're meant to be sneaky and kind of special operations oriented, but they end up just being very reliant on alpha striking and forward deployment. This list in specific focuses on faster melee units. Buff to increase their charge range with Canticle of Hate from the Chaplain, charge rerolls from Caven Shrike himself or the Raven's Blade stratagem. The Vanguard veterans, as well well, being jump infantry can also benefit from the Strike from the Skies stratagem for the ability to advance and charge and get an additional +1 to charge. The Raven Guard forward deploy abilities are really where their chapter shines. The Infiltrator stratagem allows any of the infantry, including the Vanguard Veterans, Terminators, or Centurions, to make a pre-game move and get themselves up to the middle of the table. And the Master of Ambush Warlord trait allows the Warlord to redeploy along with a unit up ahead of the army, taking advantage of defensive terrain or moving to Alpha Strike them. This makes lists like this extremely strong at going first, but a little bit weaker going second, although you can use that redeploy defensively to pull forward units back to a more defensive position. It should be noted that Raven Guard are unique in that this is one of the few ways that the game has to redeploy a unit from your deployment zone up ahead of your army. Most redeploys in the game require you to put their units back into the deployment zone, since most abilities that are on units' data sheets that allow them to deploy outside their deployment zone only come into play during the reinforcement step of the game.
You need to leave!
Now we're going to be moving on to another powerhouse chapter in the Space Marine stable, this being Salamanders. Flamers are a huge recipient of buffs in Arks of Omen. They have a pretty okay AP, which previously was almost entirely counteracted by Armor of Contempt when they were in the correct doctrine, but now, not having to worry about Armor of Contempt, they deal damage across a wide swath of the metagame much more efficiently, and with the ability to stay in Tactical Doctrine until all the way through the late game, can't really be waited out by your opponent until their wound bonus from Salamanders turns off. This list in particular is bringing a huge brick as the front and center of the army, these 3 units of 6 aggressors to make use of all those buffs to Flamers. The aggressors are incredibly difficult to kill for their points cost at only 30 points a model, with that T5, access to transhuman and defensive stratagems, as well as the Obsidian Aquila's 6+ damage ignore roll, making 3 damage weapons, which are normally the kryptonite of aggressors, much less reliable at killing them. They're also able to defend themselves against charges with devastating Overwatch. You can even potentially Overwatch with multiple units, or if Overwatch gets turned off of one unit, Overwatch with a second one, thanks to the Born Protector stratagem, which then also gives them a countercharge style of effect. Once engaged, not only the aggressors but also the other melee units in the army, like the Vanguard Veterans, can deal massive damage with the enormous strength and wound benefits that Salamanders can source. Between Crucible of Battle, Strength of the Primarch, and Adrax Agatones, +1 to wound on the charge, meaning that both aggressors and Vanguard Veterans wound almost the entirety of the game on 2s. We're following that up with 5 Devastators as well as 2 units of 6 Eradicators. We can use Relentless Determination to potentially count the heavy weapons as remaining stationary to fire without penalty if we need to, but you can also use the free strategic reserves to bring them off the sides. You won't be able to count them as remaining stationary, but you will be able to do massive damage nonetheless. Now, speaking of remaining stationary, that brings us to Ultramarines. The classic Ultramarines brick uses the special Ultramarines characters, including Chief Librarian Tigurius, to source defensive buffs alongside the offensive buffs from a character like Rabuta Gilliman to force a big brick of infantry or vehicles into the center of the table. This list in particular does that using Terminators, Aggressors, and Eradicators to hold down that middle while supporting them with Devastators and utility units. Rapid redeployment lets the forward deploying units like the Infiltrators deploy aggressively to try to contest or take enemy objectives, and then if you lose the roll to go first, pull them back into their deployment zone, or just reposition units out into the center if you had originally deployed them very defensively. Gilliman gives almost the entire army reroll 1s thanks to his huge aura to hit and wound, and a Chapter Master reroll buff, which is good on all of the ranged units who can support each other thanks to the defensive focus stratagem that lets multiple units overwatch in response to a charge. Heavy weapons are typically a natural take with Ultramarines thanks to their ability to count as stationary in the Tactical Doctrine, but there is some anti-synergy with units coming out of transports or reserve thanks to the recent FAQ that states that units coming out as reinforcements or disembarking transports can never be considered to remain stationary. That said, still having a couple Devastators able to drop out of a drop pod is still pretty useful, especially since it forces your opponent to deploy much differently than they normally would, and you can still source rerolls on those Devastator squads from both Gilliman and the Seal of Oath. This will let you pick one unit in your opponent's army to get full hit and wound rerolls against. If your opponent has a big brick or Titan or something, you can still be just dropping those drop pod Devastators into the center of the table within range of the effect of that Seal of Oath and blowing that unit away. Now moving on to a list that looks pretty similar, mostly because of the inclusion of the big G-Man himself.
The right man in the wrong place.
But this one is not painted blue, it's actually white scars. And this list is wild. It's a list after my very own heart. In fact, I kind of want to play it. The list takes advantage of the Arks of Omen update that allows Guilliman to be taken in an Arks of Omen detachment from any Space Marine chapter without breaking any of that chapter's faction abilities. That means he's eligible to be included in non-Ultramarine detachments to grant his reroll and charge buffs, and just act as a big, huge beatstick for the late game. That's huge for White Scars, who have some of the most insane charge bonuses already in the Space Marine faction, and can compound that with Guilliman's alongside their ability to advance and charge, +1 to advance and charge from Plume of the Planesrunner, and the Ride the Wind's psychic power for an additional +2 for some truly ludicrous threat ranges. You can be stacking up these guys to advancing and charging at +4, meaning even slow units like Assault Terminators are going to be hitting your opponent almost as soon as the game begins. You can also use them to make really easy charges out of Deep Strike, making putting any of these units into Strategic Reserve or Deep Strike normally incredibly strong. This is why the list is baked around these huge bricks of relatively normally slow melee infantry that then get rocketed up to immense speeds thanks to all of these stacked buffs. This includes 5 Aggressors, 2 units of 10 Assault Terminators with a mix of Storm Shields, Thunderhammers, and Lightning Claws. We also have a Master of Sanctity on a bike with that Plume of the Planesrunner to grant that charge bonus, a Primaris Librarian to grant the +2 from Ride the Winds, benefiting from Mantle of the Stormseer as well. I guess if we really wanted to push into it, we could make that guy a Chief Librarian and also take the Psychic Mastery Warlord trait for +2 to cast, although you start to run out of slots for Warlord traits very quickly, and White Scars tend to be pretty appreciative of having a lot of command points. All of that stuff is being granted objective secured from a Primaris Apothecary with Rites of War and the Vox Espiritum, making it a 9-inch Rites of War aura and increasing the range of his damage ignore ability up to 6 inches. Overall, while this list isn't quite as tanky as some of the other Terminator builds that we're going to be talking about later on in this video, it is certainly incredibly fast, and will get the benefit of alpha striking basically any other big, slow tank that you can possibly think of. Not to mention the fact that it's being followed up by the big man Guilliman himself, who's just going to be wandering around the backline of the table, granting reroll 1s to hit, and being an immense late game anchor, being incredibly difficult to kill himself and dealing a bunch of damage. And with that, we will begin to move on to non-Codex compliant chapters. Again, these are chapters that have their own printed supplement. They will typically have a large number of unique units that they'll lean very heavily on, and they'll have some specific rules regarding how they're able to bring Codex units into their army. For example, Dark Angels having a restriction on veteran units being brought in, and Black Templars' inability to take librarians. Speaking of Black Templars, that's where we'll start. Black Templars are a little bit of an interesting faction. They have a lot of unique abilities, and mostly they're the kings of scrapping for center objectives, using combat maneuvering and out-of-sequence effects to steal them. This list brings big bricks of Primaris Crusaders, Redemptors, and Terminators to do just that. It has a Rites of War aura from the tanky Chaplain, who's very difficult to kill with 10 Hauser's Bones that reduce incoming damage to 1. So he can stick around for a while and has a lot of wounds to lose over the course. But the units outside of that aura can still be given objective secured for 1 command point. Whichever unit is tanking in the front can also be protected by the Litany of Divine Protection from Grimaldus, and any additional units can use Devout Push to get themselves on objectives in the opponent's fight phase behind whichever unit is taking the fire. Many Black Templars lists use a combination of Chief Apothecaries alongside upgraded unit sergeants using Relic Bearers upgrades that you buy for points to make their units significantly harder to kill, like the Icon of Hindman or the Crux Obsidian. These confer defensive benefits to the model carrying them, who you can then assign wounds to. That model will die, and if the unit's not wiped out, the Chief Apothecary can then bring them back for free in the next turn. The downside is that you are relying on the unit not to be killed after their sergeant goes down, and that is not always the case. So this list in particular is going to be eschewing that in exchange for just having more beef. It does take Sigismund Steel on the Terminator unit to give full rerolls against a single enemy unit, and the Sword of Judgment on one of the Crusader squads, alongside Champion of the Feast to improve the stats of the Terminator Sergeant. Other than that, it's mostly relying on a big brick of Redemptor Dreadnoughts and a 5-model Eradicator squad to back up that big Terminator squad and the Primaris Crusaders in the fight over the center. If you can chew through the Terminators, finally kill the objective secured Primaris Crusaders, you still have all of the powerful characters, including High Marshal Helbrecht, to deal with, and 3 Redemptor Dreadnoughts, which a lot of armies will have run out of beef to actually kill. Moving on, let's talk about a chapter that has been in the spotlight for a while here. Let's talk about Blood Angels next. And this list is a natural evolution of lists that we've seen from the likes of the current ITC champion, Jack Harpster, whose list and tournament win I talked about in a recent video from LVO. That was at the end of Warzone Nephilim, however, and now we're in Arks of Omen. Blood Angels have a lot to prove, being one of the poorest performing Space Marine chapters in the format. At least one thing hasn't changed for Blood Angels, since the backbone of this list are its Sanguinary Guard, backed up with a brick of Aggressors and their Chapter Master. Having a unit like Aggressors that can put out appreciable firepower during the Tactical Doctrine is a huge benefit, since it's a long wait all the way until the whole army benefits from the Assault Doctrine and all of the Blood Angels' special abilities start turning on. Sanguinary Guard get a little bit of armor cracking buff in the form of free Inferno pistols that we see them carrying, letting them potentially knock out 2 enemy units on the turn that they commit into combat, shooting one to death and then charging and murdering another in melee, especially when being buffed with rerolls from their Chapter Master. The Chapter Master is also super useful at buffing those Aggressors, since he will affect both their ranged attacks and their melee attack, who with -1 to hit thanks to their Power Fists can sometimes flub a little bit. The list also includes a Death Company squad, which unfortunately no longer scores Fury of the Lost, Blood Angel's old secondary objective that was very powerful. It's still an important include to force enemies to respect its threat range, since using Forlorn Fury allows it a pregame move, which can send it into their opponent deployment zone on the first turn of the game. Alongside a lot of utility units like Scouts, Assault Squads, a Landspeeder Storm, and Infiltrators, this army is also excellent at scoring secondary objectives. Once the Assault Doctrine kicks over as well, all of those models are going to be lethal in combat with +1 AP, attacks, and wounds on all of their melee swings. So we talked about the #1 Space Marine chapter from Warzone Nephilim. Let's move on to what is probably the #1 chapter for Arks of Omen, that being Dark Angels. Honestly, it was a little surprising that Dark Angels were the sleeper hit of Arks of Omen, but they're able to combine the unique benefits of their Deathwing and Ravenwing units in the single Arks of Omen detachment, and kind of counteract the fact that they don't get all of their buffs for being a pure first or second company detachment. Almost all Dark Angel lists begin similar to this one, with a brick of 20 Deathwing Terminators, supported by a Ravenwing Apothecary and Ancient with the Pennant of Remembrance to make them even tankier by reducing damage on the frontmost Terminator squad. Most lists also use Samael and or Talon Masters to provide some untargetable fire support. Some lists also run Ezekiel for psychic support. This one instead is taking Lazarus to provide his protection against mortal wounds. The big benefit of Dark Angels in Arks of Omen is their ability to stay in Devastator Doctrine for a long time. This sounds a little bit weird since we're taking so many melee units, especially with the focus of the list being on those Deathwing squad, but the Ravenwing units in the list benefit enormously from the extended movement that Devastator Doctrine gives them. This means that in addition to the Deathwing brick, all of these Dark Angels lists are going to be bringing a Ravenwing contingent. Whether that is built up of Landspeeders or Black Knights, that's kind of up to personal opinion. Black Knights especially are solid with their synergy with weapons of the Dark Age, although we also see Landspeeder Vengeances as well as Storm Speeders being taken in this slot. This list in particular is using a brick of 9 attack bikes to fill that role. And that moves us on to probably the most esoteric chapter on the list, the Xenos Hunters of the Deathwatch. Deathwatch is in an interesting place in Arks of Omen, since they don't get a huge benefit from the ability to lock into their doctrines. Deathwatch get an allocation of doctrines that they can use at any time over the course of the game, so they can't build to sit in Devastator Doctrine for the entire game, since they're only going to be able to use it for 1 round. For those who don't know, the power and flexibility of the Deathwatch chapter comes from their Kill Team units, which is a unique type of unit that's composed of different data sheets all using the same armored mark. This list list in particular is made up of a backbone comprised of these kill teams, including an Indomitor team and 2 Proteus teams. The Indomitor team adds a lot of fire support with heavy intercessors and eradicators, while the Proteus teams add some close-range punch with lots of meltaguns and heavy thunder hammers, a unique variety of thunder hammers for Deathwatch specifically that gives them additional damage and AP. Long-range fire has always been a little tough for Deathwatch to source, since their kill teams are mostly composed of troop-style units. So, to shore up that weakness, it actually delves into some of the mechanics that Arks of Omen brings to them. In this case, a pair of allied Freeblade Helverins. These Helverins are using the Strike and Shield sub-faction ability, which gives them a trans-hitman style effect, only able to be hit on 4+ in melee, and allows them to ignore low AP weapons. A lot of times you'll see armigers focusing a little bit more on their ranged output or maneuverability, either with the Hunters of Beasts subfaction ability, giving them +1 to hit against monsters and vehicles, or Mysterious Guardians that lets them strategic reserve onto the table in the first turn of the game. In this case, this list has just elected to take these armigers being a little bit more defensively oriented in melee, which is certainly valid given the fact that the Helverins are very bad in melee themselves and will probably not be able to knock themselves out of melee, so they might be stuck in there for a little while. All right, we are almost at the end of the video, everybody, because we are down to the Howling Berserkers of the Space Wolves. This list in particular is using a very common successor combo to get +1 to hit, similar to the Space Wolf core chapter tactic and exploding sixes. That's going to stack on top of the Space Wolves super doctrine of exploding sixes in the fight phase, especially effective on Wolfen and Wolfguard. Space Wolves also have some very specific synergies with the free war gear that Space Marines have gotten in the most recent Munitorum Field Manual update. This is because a lot of their units, most notably Skyclaws, are able to pack themselves to the brim with meltaguns. Pun kind of intended. 2 of the units' models are special weapon carriers, so they can both take special weapons, in addition to the pack leader being able to equip one. On top of that, you can also include a Wolfguard pack leader in the unit who can also take a combi weapon, allowing you in a small unit of 6 models to take 4 melta weapons. This is a crazy amount of firepower for an extremely cheap cost, and that's why we see 3 in the list. The Chapter Master also helps out the mass of melee infantry, with his fight last from Armor of Rust and maneuverability from the Hunter Warlord trait. And backing all that up are a couple utility units, including a unit of 6 Long Fangs in a drop pod, which are able to use the Keen Senses stratagem to ignore their move and shoot penalty for disembarking the vehicle. This is similar to the way Iron Hands interact with their heavy weapons, more so than Ultramarines. Ultramarines consider themselves to have to remain stationary, which is why the most recent FAQ about remaining stationary hammers them so hard. Instead, both Iron Hands and Space Wolves just ignore the penalty that they would have for normally moving and shooting, which means the unit is still considered to have moved, but the heavy weapons no longer give them -1 to hit. On top of that, we have a Landspeeder Swarm filled with scouts to add some utility and perform secondary objectives, and altogether fit the Space Wolf theme of being a well-balanced list between both ranged and melee profiles. And with that, that is every single Space Marine chapter in Warhammer 40k. Let me know down in the comment if any of these lists strike your fancy, and if you are considering playing a similar list in your Arks of Omen Space Marine army. Big thanks to Magnet Baron for supporting the video. Big thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, or who is a YouTube member or a Twitch subscriber. All those people are wonderful, and I love them. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.